You know, Matthew can be kind of a tough guy. I know it's probably not politic to say things like that, but we've had in the last couple of weeks some dark stories, and there's some more to come in this gospel. We see Matthew use the stories that Jesus told to try to win the argument that Matthew is making. He's in the middle of an argument with the Pharisees, the opponents of his day, as they vie for the loyalty of Matthew's community, which is not yet separate from the Jewish community. Remember, Christianity was still considered at this time just kind of a sect, a group within Judaism. So in today's parable, Jesus uses the familiar imagery of the vineyard. We've had a number of vineyard parables. And this is the vineyard and the unfaithful managers of the vineyard, the tenants, who, and Matthew uses this story that Jesus told to try to score some points against the Pharisees. A landowner plants a vineyard. He digs the wine press, he puts up the fence, he builds a watchtower, and does everything else necessary to invest in, to plan for a good harvest. And then he leases it to tenants to run things while he goes away. And when the harvest comes in, he sends his servants to go collect his due, the share that's owed him because of his ownership and his investment and his industry. But as you heard, these tenants, when the servants of the landowner approach, they beat them, they stone them, and even kill the servants. Well, the landowner sends a second round of servants, and the same thing happens. And finally, he sends his son, and the brutes kill him too, hoping that if the son is dead and there's no heir, and the landlord stays abroad until he dies, then maybe they'll inherit the vineyard and keep the extra produce, not just for one season, but forever. And then at the end of the story, Jesus asks the critical question. When the owner of the vineyard returns, what will he do to those tenants? And right on cue, the Pharisees and chief priests, like Costellos to Jesus' abbot, they fall for the trap, hook, line, and sinker, and they say, he will put those wretches to miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time, which opens the opportunity for Jesus to explain the punchline of this dark little joke until at last they get it. And then they want to get him. Now, it seems a little, vicious for this part of the Bible, for the story of the love of God given to us in the person of Jesus. But this parable has, in addition to relaying to us a story that Jesus told, it has a function in the overall narrative that Matthew is presenting us. It's part of the building of tension and anticipation in the story of Jesus, as it goes from the confrontation where Jesus knocks over the tables in the temple to which was really a big confrontation, to as the pressure builds and the tension builds to Jesus' arrest and trial. And Matthew carefully sets his stories up so that there's a kind of, we can feel and see the kind of inevitable logic and pressure that's building toward the cross. Second of all, this parable, for the benefit of Matthew's contemporaries, shows up the Pharisees as bad guys and encourages the newly developing followers of Jesus to leave the temple and become part of the church, to become true followers of Jesus. Third, it offers a theological explanation for the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and it helps to support those Christians who were then in the minority, a persecuted minority. It supports them in their faith and their determination in the face of suffering and persecution. Matthew's trying to provide them with an understanding of themselves as beloved children of God, even if they aren't so beloved by the temple authorities. Really, what we're seeing here in Matthew is a bitter sibling rivalry. The younger sibling breaking away from the power and the dominance of the older one and suffering some consequences for the audacity of doing this. Naturally enough, the older sibling is going to come in for some negative press when the younger one is the one telling the story. Now, most younger siblings can attest to the feelings of powerlessness and frustration at being both bossed around and dismissed by an older brother or sister. If Mariella were sitting here, she could tell you all about that. I'm sure she could tell all of us. As an oldest child, I can't imagine what that would be about. When children, usually the older brother or sister is just bigger or more sophisticated or more experienced, thus can get his or her way just by virtue of being in the world a little longer. I'm sure Gail has a clue about this too. My grandmother told the story of being a little girl, and she had this long auburn hair, and she adored her two big brothers. She liked them so much that she liked to follow them around everywhere. And of course, the last thing that John and Fred wanted was to have little Helen tagging around behind them as they went on their little boy adventures around the little town where they lived in Pennsylvania. So one day, they put a stop to it by picking her up and sticking her into an abandoned tar barrel. And she couldn't get out because it was too tall. And also, there was enough sticky tar still on the sides and in the bottom of the barrel that her shoes, her dress, they were ruined, and all her hair had to be cut off. The little ones feel mistreated and persecuted until they grow up and things have a way of evening out. And sometimes even the younger outstrips the older. The difficulty we have today with this parable in Matthew is that the fledgling Christian movement that Matthew represents here went from being an underdog, the persecuted minority, to dominant and the older sibling in just a couple of centuries. That younger sibling grew up to be the powerful one. And ever since, passages like this story in Matthew have fanned the flames of anti-Semitism and sometimes have done serious harm. Once the younger sibling was in charge, the "you're going to get yours" fist shaking of the beaten down younger sibling turns into a license to turn the tables and indeed sock it to them, an attitude that has had disastrous consequences for Jews throughout history. So what do we do with a passage like this? Well, Martin Luther once said that sometimes you have to squeeze a biblical passage a little until it leaks the gospel. And so with a little patience and faithful pressure, we're going to do a little squeezing to get the good juice of the gospel. Because it really was a kind of harebrained scheme. Did those tenants really think that their plan was something that they were ever going to get away with? What made them think that they would ever be the ones to inherit this land and business? It was kind of crazy. You know, it might have been a legal possibility, but it's not like the owner had gone to a distant land and had disappeared altogether. He sent his servants, he sent more servants, he sent his son. Who's to say he didn't have another son, or more servants, or an army, or maybe he just come back himself? It's like a Ponzi scheme or Bernie Madoff. Didn't they realize that eventually all that scheming and killing would result in the unraveling of their plan and disaster? On the other hand, they were not nearly as crazy as that vineyard owner. Think about it. First, he sent his servants, and they get beaten up, rocks thrown at them, killed. Then he sends more. Doesn't send the police, not armed thugs, not an army, but more servants. And the same thing happens again. And then the landowner gets a brilliant idea of sending his son, his heir, alone, to deal with these bloodthirsty hooligans. It makes no sense. Who would do this? No one would do this. Except maybe a crazy landlord who is so desperate to be close to be connected to these unruly tenants, that he will do anything, risk anything to reach out to them. This landowner acts more like a desperate parent, willing to do anything or say anything or try anything to connect with a beloved and wayward child. Sounds more like that than like a businessman. It really is pretty crazy. The kind of crazy that is born of love. What will that landlord do when he comes? Jesus asks. And all they can imagine is violence. He will put those wretches to a miserable death. But notice that answer, that's not Jesus' answer. Those Pharisees condemn themselves. Those elder siblings say what seems only right to them, oblivious that they're talking about themselves. We don't have to answer Jesus' question the way those Pharisees did. We can remember, actually, what the landlord did, what he in fact did. To Jesus' question, we can remember that the landlord already demonstrated his intentions. He sent 2 waves of servants to try to convince the tenants. And finally, he sent his son. The landlord sent his son, Jesus, to the world, to all of us who have hoarded God's blessings for ourselves and not given God God's own due. And when we killed him, God raised him from the dead and sent him back to us yet again, still bearing the message of God's desperate, crazy love for us. Albert Einstein said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. It would be crazy for God to send God's Son, because who in their right mind would love people like that, like us, like that, especially given what humankind and we have done in the past? No one would do that. No one human anyway. But God does. God does not follow our standards of mental balance. God is crazy in love with us and will go to any lengths, even death on a cross and resurrection from the grave, to show us that. Now, it's true, Matthew does finish the parable with Jesus accusing and condemning the Pharisees himself. But Matthew has already witnessed to a God who's more merciful than I think even Matthew can imagine. Jesus kind of slips free of Matthew's grasp for a moment, not simply to stand in judgment of Matthew and all the rest of history that has used this story to validate our own causes, but even more, to introduce to us to the desperate, crazy love of God, offered not once, not twice, but 1,000,000 times or more to all who will receive it. Jesus is greater than our fear or our insecurity, and manages again and again to twist free of our expectations in order to present to us yet again the crazy mercy of God. Let us pray. Gracious God, we know about this sibling rivalry business. When we're feeling powerful and justified, we are quick to condemn others. When we feel like the underdog, the younger and powerless, we shake our fists and promise someday sweet revenge. Remind us of your crazy love, that in your Son Jesus, such divisions, such anxieties about power and ownership are meaningless. That in your eyes, in your heart, we are all your beloved children. Make us indeed grateful, and may we praise your glory forever. Amen.